All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. My name is Steve Keller. I am the curriculum developer of online platforms and programs for the YMCA's Youth Cannabis Awareness Program. Joining me this afternoon, we have Andreas Ariza. How are you today, Andreas?
Hi, Steve. I'm very good. Thank you so much for bringing me on today. I am the Education and Awareness Coordinator for the Youth Cannabis Awareness Program for the region of British Columbia. So I am very pleased to be joining you today in your presentation, Steve.
Thank you so much. And I am personally presenting from Peterborough, Ontario, upon territory of the Mississauga Anishinaabe, adjacent to the Haudenosaunee territory. And it's a community where I've grown up. I've learned a great deal in working with and connecting with the communities of Tyendinaga, of Alderville, of Curve Lake, and of Hiawatha. And I do certainly encourage those of you that are listening today to make efforts to connect with, learn from, and support where possible the Indigenous communities and populations within your respective regions. And so for those of you that are attending today, I did mention beforehand that this webinar will be recorded. It will be made available on our website at ymcagta.org/YCAP. We will also put that into the chat panel. It should be up online within the next week or two. And the nature of the presentation today is exploring cannabis and the adolescent brain. We have a lot of material to cover, so we will move right into the nature of the presentation. So before we get started, a little bit about our program for those of you that have maybe never seen us before. The Youth Cannabis Awareness Program is a cannabis neutral program, meaning that we do not promote the use of cannabis, nor do we make value judgments regarding recreational cannabis use. Our intention is to provide youth with the most accurate and unbiased information as possible, which leads us into the importance of promoting a balanced perspective. We do share information and resources provided about both use and risks of cannabis use. Our presentations are evidence-based, again, meaning that our materials are based on unbiased research from both recognized and well-respected resources. Now, the third component of our program is that we do promote harm reduction. Andreas, how would you explain harm reduction in a presentation?
Yeah, I guess when we do these presentations in schools, the best way that we define harm reduction is just an approach in which we understand that people will make their own decisions related to their own lives. And rather than creating a judgment towards it, as Steve mentioned, our intention is to provide people with information, skills, and tools so that they can make informed decisions on their own, right? There's a lot of different aspects in which we can see harm reduction in our daily lives. For example, very simple example, wearing a mask in the middle of a pandemic for the past 2.5 years is an example of harm reduction. But obviously today we're going to be focusing in a lot of strategies of harm reduction specific to recreational cannabis use.
Wonderful. Thank you, Andreas. Now, if you do have any questions or comments during the presentation, you're certainly more than welcome to place them into the chat panel, and Andreas or myself will try to get to them either in chat or we'll discuss them live during the presentation. We will also be putting some questions to you, the audience, as well, while we're doing some discussion back and forth to promote a little bit of engagement between ourselves and certainly the audience listening in today. Now, over the course of this presentation, we essentially have 4 major goals for today. The first is that we want to establish an understanding of how exactly the human brain develops as we grow up. From there, we are going to look at how cannabis can affect our brain, both in terms of those processes that are ongoing throughout our developmental phase, as well as each particular section of the brain, and how certain compounds and chemicals within cannabis may interact or affect these portions and their functionality. The third thing we're going to be exploring is potential risks and best practices for reducing harms associated with cannabis use. And finally, wrapping up our presentation with a discussion about local, regional, provincial, and federal support services that are available across Canada. So our first section today really explores how the brain actually develops as we grow up. Now, a child's brain essentially has 2 major growth periods. First is when they're very, very young, and second is later on during that period of adolescence. By the time a youth is around 6 years old, their brain is already developed to approximately 90 to 95% of its adult size. These early years, we are aware, are a critical time for brain development, but the brain still does need a lot of remodeling and sort of honing of skills and capabilities before it can function as a fully matured component in the body. Now, the brain's remodeling happens quite intensively during adolescence. We see a lot of different processes going on that we're going to talk about in this presentation that really continues until a person is in their mid-20s. So we're looking around sort of age 25. And the rated stages that the brain develops depends entirely on age, experiences, and really hormonal changes that we see during puberty. Now, We do look at sort of various sort of processes and structures of the body, and we know that the human body is made up of very tiny portions that we would see as cells, right? Cells are the minimal functional structures within our bodies, which when grouped together lead to the creation of tissues. These tissues are what comprise our organs, and when certain organs work together, they do construct different systems in the body. And you'll have learned about systems throughout your life. Maybe when you were younger, you talked about the digestive system or the respiratory system, or the cardiovascular system. Today, we're going to be focusing on two systems in the human body. The first is the nervous system, so looking really at how the brain interacts with the rest of the body. The second is a system that's really only received a lot more attention since about the mid to late 20th century, which is the endocannabinoid system. These will really be the two rather focuses of the presentation today. So if we begin with the nervous system, we need to look at the smallest structure, which is the neuron. Andreas, what do neurons do?
Right. Well, Steve, neurons are specialized cells that their basic role is to communicate information to other neurons and to other parts of our bodies. So as we go along and we talk about information, we might change and talk about electric signaling or chemical messages. So these are the types of information that neurons relay from one another. Now, neurons being very specialized cells, their structure is very tight to their functionality. And so as we can see here, the head of the cell has these hair-like structures known as dendrites, which receive information from its environment or its surroundings. And then that information in the form of electric impulses passes along this long arm known as the axon. And eventually when that information reaches the axon terminals, it is then passed on to another neuron or to a muscle cell or to another part of the body. There's another part here that is called the myelin sheath, and it's going to get a little bit sciencey, but our job is always going to be to relay this conversation back to how is cannabis related to this. And so we're bringing this up because we're trying to understand what is happening in an adolescent person's brain as they are growing up. And so the first process that is happening has to do with these structures, the myelin sheaths. So myelin sheaths are lipids that are insulating this long arm. The best way that I explain this when I'm doing this with a group of young people is imagine having, let's say, this cable, a copper wire surrounded by rubber. And so like that rubber creates an insulating property. That is sort of what those myelin sheaths are trying to accomplish, to insulate the arm of or the axon of a neuron, so that those electric impulses can pass on more quickly and more effectively. Now, when we talk about myelination, it is simply the strengthening of certain cells that are receiving a lot of input or that are performing a lot of activities through our day-to-day activities, right? So there's a lot of different things that can help myelinate our brain cells, which would be like, I always like to tell young people, is like taking your brain cells to the gym and like making them exercise. There's a lot of different ways of exercising. So for example, people who speak a second language, they might have a certain part of their brain cells myelinated for that communicative ability. People who are very good with instruments or who play guitar or who are very artistic in that regard, maybe they have another part of their brain that is myelinated for those faculties, right? So the more we do something, our brain is gonna receive a lot of input to make those neurons stronger at passing that information. So that is one thing that is happening for an adolescent person's brain as they are growing up, myelination. Now, again, what does cannabis have to do with this myelination process? Well, research has found that THC, which is the psychoactive component in cannabis, can weaken these myelin sheaths. And so it's, for example, if I always like to say, if you were going camping and you were sleeping in your sleeping bag at the top of a mountain, but your sleeping bag had a little hole in it. So it wouldn't be very good at insulating or at creating that protection around the core of that axon or whatever is inside. So what happens to neurons is that they become slow at passing information across axons. And obviously, the more efficient and the faster a neuron is, the better it's going to be for the nervous system. The other thing that happens with cannabis is that certainly there's an element in cannabis or in THC in particular that resonates particularly well with the human brain. And we're going to explore in a little bit why that is. But what happens when a person is consuming cannabis and they're having a positive experience with it is that they are myelinating certain brain cells and training them to think that this is a stimulus that they want. Do you mind clicking, Steve?
Absolutely.
Thank you. So our brains become used to feeling good from this input. So it's sort of like training your brain cells like, oh, okay, so this made me feel good, so therefore I need more. Now, In our intention of being evidence-based, we understand that sometimes very sciencey information can be tergiversed, or it can be sometimes used as a scare tactic, and that is not our intention at all in our program. So we will also do our best as we go along to call out where the research might be limited or lacking in terms of solid background for drawing conclusions. And this is one of those instances. There's limited knowledge on the relationship between myelination and cannabis use for a couple of reasons. One, the research that we found out there has been done specifically on acute or very heavy cannabis users. So it's hard to draw conclusions on people who might be sporadic users or people who perhaps have just initiated their cannabis use versus someone who is a long-time user. The other reason is, and I want to say this with as much confidence as possible, there hasn't been a whole lot more research about the relationship between myelination and THC since about 2005, if I recall correctly. So just to recap, we've talked about one of the processes that is happening in an adolescent person's brain as they are growing up, which is myelination. Now, let's see what happens when that information passes from one cell to the next, as we see here in this diagram. So cells or neurons rather are connected with one another, but they're not actually clumped together. They're not overlapping. They actually have these small spaces or pockets or gaps in between them that are known as synapses. And synapses, in short, are pockets that help information or chemical messages pass from one neuron to the next, right? Now, the reason I bring this up is because the second process that is happening for an adolescent person's brain is this idea of synaptic pruning. Now, sounds like a bit of a complicated word, but if we think about pruning, maybe we've heard it like in terms of gardening, right? So it's sort of like trimming something, giving it a different shape. And so that is exactly what our brains are doing when we are adolescents. So when we're very young, there's a lot of connections, a lot of synaptic pathways that are in our brain. Most of them or some of them are not needed. So if you take a look at the image here that we have, all those black nodes, all those black dots would be connections between neurons. Now, as we grow old and some of our brain cells become more specialized or become better at the things that they're learning to do, but others are not used as often, there is a change here that happens. I wonder if you can click, Steve. So those connections that are used frequently become stronger, but the ones that are not used that frequently are pruned away. So that is what this idea of synaptic pruning is. And we really like to tie it with this idea of use it or lose it. So for example, if you're someone whose parents speak a different language than English, and in your household, you spoke that language for like your formative years, but you didn't really use it that much, and you kind of understand, but can't really speak that language, you might have lost some of those synaptic connections. They might have been pruned because they weren't being used as often. The reason why this happens is that so those connections that stay actually can perform a better job. But again, let's see, how does cannabis affect synaptic pruning for an adolescent person's brain? So we know that exposure to cannabis early on in life can accelerate the pruning of unused connections. So we know that this pruning is happening to everyone, but it's sort of like if instead of like, like doing a little bit of harvesting trees on a mountain, you just like clear cut the whole mountain, right? So you're really accelerating all those connections, a lot of the connections being pruned away. And also it is another part of the conversation that we like to have with young people is that when they give cannabis too much of their focus of their time, they're depriving themselves from exposing themselves to situations or stimuli that could provide input for their brains to develop, right? So if a young person is choosing to disengage from some of their extracurricular activities for just using cannabis, they're lacking opportunities that could help their brains not only myelinate, but also prune away connections that are not needed to make those earlier connections stronger. So those are the two things that are happening for an adolescent person. And when we talk a lot about the harms of cannabis to the human body, a lot of them are similar for young people and for adults, but where we really draw a difference is here, because adult brains have already undergone these processes. So this is sort of like the crux of the issue for young people.
Absolutely. And I love how you explained that part, Andreas. Thank you so much.
No worries.
Now that we're looking at the processes of how the brain develops, we're certainly going to talk about the sort of functions of each sort of section of the brain. But before we actually get to the brain itself, we want to look at how cannabis can actually interact with the human body. So in this section, we're going to be exploring really how that happens. And the reason that we've talked about the nervous system before is because the chemicals that are found in cannabis interact in a big part with the organs that are present in our nervous system. So let's have a bit of a look at that, right? Andreas was speaking about processes like myelination and pruning, and I mentioned a little while ago that we were going to talk about the nervous system, but we were also going to talk about what we know as the endocannabinoid system, or the ECS. This is a system that really gained a lot more attention and research in the mid-20th century. It's a system that helps to maintain balance in different bodily functions, and we understand the sense of balance as a term known as homeostasis, when things are maintaining a fairly constant sort of flux, right? When appetite and digestion are being regulated, when we're getting regular sleep, we're reacting to pain or stimuli in a certain way. We see inflammation and other immune responses can be affected by the ECS, as well as mood, metabolism, and learning and memory. But again, as the research into the ECS is still fairly new, there is more to be researched, and we may see more come out of this in future reports and in future literature. Now, the endocannabinoid system itself is really comprised of two major components. The first is what we would know as cannabinoids. Now, cannabinoids are produced in the human body. We do have natural forming cannabinoids, which are referred to as endocannabinoids. These are responsible for working as messengers to send the actual signals from one cell to the next. And the way that these cannabinoids actually send signals is by binding to the second part of the ECS, which we know as cannabinoid receptors. These are found in the membranes of cells, and when presented with a cannabinoid, they act sort of like a key in its right lock, really unlocking or eliciting a specific chemical reaction. The ECS is also involved in modulating other neurotransmitter systems. So some of the other transmitters that you may be familiar with, such as dopamine, can be involved with the ECS, and we are going to talk about a few others as well. Now, you'll also notice that cannabinoids we also see produced in one other place, which is in cannabis plants. These are what we know as phytocannabinoids. So these are actually the ones that are produced in the plant itself, as opposed to being created inside the human body. And what we know is that the structure of these is actually fairly similar. So we have phytocannabinoids in the body, which we know as anandamide or 2-AG. But the phytocannabinoids that we see, these are those ones that we often speak about in other cannabis presentations. Anyone that sat in on our presentation on Let's Talk About Cannabis, or perhaps talking with youth about cannabis, we've talked about these cannabinoids being THC, tetrahydrocannabinol, or CBD, cannabidiol. These are not produced obviously naturally within the body, but we do find them in the cannabis plant. And similar to the endocannabinoids, these chemicals can actually react with this system. Now, we talked about the cannabinoids, but we also need to explore the cannabinoid receptors. These are found in sort of different sectors of the body. We have two sort of different types. We refer to one as CB1 receptors, and the second is CB2. Now, CB1 receptors are found primarily in the central nervous system, and these tend to interact most with THC. And if you think about the effects of THC on the body, particularly the psychoactive properties that affect the way that we think, view the world, feel, and react to situations, it may not come as much of a surprise that THC tends to be the cannabinoid in cannabis that binds to the receptors we see in the brain and the rest in the CNS. CB2 receptors, meanwhile, located in the peripheral nervous system, the GI tract and immune system cells, these tend to be receptors that you'll see bind a little bit more often with CBD or cannabidiol. So we don't necessarily see this psychoactive response to CBD, but we do find that it can bind to a different part of the endocannabinoid system. So I also mentioned that the ECS can interact and be a little bit responsible for handling and modulating the neurotransmitters that we see in the body. Now, neurotransmitters, to summarize these, are chemicals that allow neurons to communicate with each other throughout the body. And the first three that we know are key for the maturation and the development of adolescent behavior are dopamine, serotonin, and melatonin. Dopamine, I've heard in the past referred to as like a pleasure-seeking neurotransmitter, but it doesn't only elicit pleasurable responses, it can also elicit what we know as the fight or flight response. It can be released when we do certain things that we enjoy, such as eating or drinking water, but we may also find it being released by the brain when we experience things like pleasure, but also pain. Serotonin, meanwhile, acts more as a mood regulator. It's more associated with general wellness, as well as the control of impulses and arousal. While melatonin we see being associated with the regulation of circadian rhythms or the sleep-wake cycle, right? Now, another one that we do like to point out here is what we see as gamma aminobutyric acid or GABA. Andreas, how would you explain this particular neurotransmitter? Because I love the way that you actually explain this one.
Yeah, so I think going back to that idea that you were saying about cannabinoids being a key and then the receptors being a lock, when you put that key into a lock and you twist it, so what happens is that the body releases neurotransmitters. Most neurotransmitters have a function for performing something, right? So imagine the first three that we were talking about, dopamine, serotonin, and melatonin, sort of like being like the gas pedals in a car. But at some point, your body is going to have enough of whatever it is producing. So it also needs to have a signal for stopping the production of neurotransmitters. And that is what the GABA neurotransmitters do. It's sort of like the brake pedal in our neurotransmitter system, which tells you, okay, you have enough dopamine, stop producing that. You have enough serotonin, you're good with that, right? And so it's particularly tricky because when people consume cannabis, we're going to focus a lot on dopamine throughout the rest of the presentation because cannabis releases to a great extent very high levels of dopamine in our body. And sometimes what happens is that when our levels of dopamine are really high, maybe our GABA neurotransmitters are trying to kick in, tell our body, okay, stop producing dopamine, you have enough of that. But there is a surplus and it creates an imbalance.
Now, how can you actually boost dopamine levels in the body, Andreas? You talk about the fact that these neurotransmitters exist and can be released in certain responses. What are some natural ways that we could think of to actually boost this neurotransmitter level in the body naturally?
Dopamine in particular is related to a lot of our basic needs as human beings, right? So for example, eating, drinking water, moving around, doing exercise, even spending time with friends or people because we are social beings at the end of the day and doing things that bring us pleasure. Like we have a couple of examples here, like listening to music or reading or meditating, but honestly, whatever fulfills anyone's recreational hobbies or whatnot, it's a good idea or it's a good way to boost dopamine levels in your body without having to resort to external substances like cannabis.
Absolutely. And as you mentioned, we know that using substances like cannabis can actually cause the brain to produce almost not synthetic dopamine, but larger amounts of this neurotransmitter, which can sometimes trigger the reward system, providing persons with feelings of euphoria or joy, which is part of the explanation or a beginning really of an understanding of why people that may choose to use substances might choose to do so over and over again. Now, how can cannabis affect our brain? We know it affects sort of four major components, including things like movement, emotional regulation, memory and learning, and decision making, right? And the regions of the brain that undergo the most fine tuning during the teenage years are those that are responsible for these sort of portions. And again, these are potentially the most susceptible to cannabis when they're not quite fully developed. Why is that, Andreas? Why is it that these parts are so susceptible?
So these are parts of our brain that have very large numbers of CB1 receptors. So it's interesting that they're tied to these functions that our brain regulates, like our movement, memory and learning and whatnot. But it's precisely because of the amount of receptors. So when cannabis enters our brain, it's going to bind to those areas in particular, and it's going to create certain interesting effects that we're going to explore as we continue on our next section.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So what we're going to be talking about here is exactly what is happening in the brain when cannabis is consumed, right? We know that cannabis can change how the way that the brain works by changing the way that the actual nerve cells will actually communicate. And as we talked about before, we know that neurons send messages to each other by releasing chemicals referred to as neurotransmitters, released from a neuron, traveling across those synapses, and then attaching to specific receptors that are located on a nearby neuron. So this process coordinates everything and regulates everything in terms of how we think, what we feel, and what it is that we actually do. And we know that when cannabis is consumed, that THC will enter the bloodstream, carried to organs throughout the body, including the brain. And as we showed earlier discussing in the ECS, THC likes to bind to CB1 receptors in the endocannabinoid system, right? And because so many of these receptors are found in many parts of the brain, the effects of THC can be quite wide-ranging. So how does THC affect the brain? Well, we know that it can affect movement, which can be regulated in our occipital lobe and the cerebellum, emotions in the amygdala and the nucleus accumbens, learning in the thalamus and the hippocampus, and of course, decision-making in the prefrontal cortex. And so these regions of our brain are regulated primarily by dopamine in one way or really another. So let's explore these a little bit, shall we? Let's start with the cerebellum. Andreas, what can we say about the cerebellum? What is its functions? What does it do?
Right. So a couple of cool things that I like to call out when we begin this section is that the human brain develops back to front. So it's no wonder that when we're little, the first thing that we learn to do is crawl and then walk and then move and whatnot. So the cerebellum and the occipital lobe, which are those areas that are color coded in purple, are really going to help function or regulate our bodily movements. And so the cerebellum is in charge of our voluntary movement coordination. So that could be as our movements performing a sport or walking around, or even our eyes jumping from one line to the next on a page. It also helps control our balance and our posture. So certainly when someone consumes THC and a lot of that THC goes into the receptors that are in the cerebellum, it can impair coordination that is needed for certain things. Like, for example, performing in sports. Oh, do you mind? Yeah. Riding a bicycle, playing instruments, performing high intensity sports, anything that relates or that involves your voluntary body movements. Now, if we look at the next one, the occipital lobe, also very in tune with our bodily movements, but this one has an extra layer to it. So it's basically the occipital lobe connects our senses, so our sight, our hearing, and it sort of like relays that information to create something in our body, some kind of movement. So for example, it's particularly important for driving because it helps us judge distances on a mirror. It helps us recognize facial or spatial cues. And so, for example, if I were to throw someone a ball and, like having that hand-eye coordination for catching it mid-air, all of these things our occipital lobe is doing. And a lot of these things or these small faculties come at play, for example, driving, right? And so when we talk about driving, it could be not necessarily just a vehicle or a car, but it could also be a snowmobile or any like a motorboat. Anything that has an engine is something that under the cannabis law, for example, is not allowed to be driven if someone is under the effects of cannabis, because it is the occipital lobe that is being affected.
Absolutely. Now, if we look at the nucleus accumbens, this is sort of the side of the brain where dopamine is really being released. And often it's referred to as kind of the pleasure reward center of the brain. It's responsible for things like regulating our motivation, as well as, again, sort of that pleasure and reward system. When we do things that we like, when we play a game that we enjoy, when we accomplish a presentation, when we eat something that we like, when we see someone that we care about, the nucleus accumbens gets flooded with dopamine. And as we talked about before, consuming cannabis can also release a great amount of dopamine, particularly into the nucleus accumbens. And with chronic exposure over time, cannabis use may rewire the pathways in the brain, and this can in turn lead to what we would refer to as cannabis dependence, right? THC can change dopamine levels that are often released by doing those things that we already enjoy, identifying passions, identifying drives, developing hobby skills and talents, or even establishing social relationships. And one thing to consider here as well is if we're training the brain that using cannabis releases this high level of dopamine, which we know elicits more pleasure, a potential risk, particularly for adolescents as they're developing, is these other activities that they enjoy. The sports, the hobbies, the games, the people that they start to care about, they may find that these interests become less apparent in favor of something that would elicit on a chemical level a greater response, in this case being dopamine, or sorry, in this case being THC. And as we speak about when we look at potential signs of problematic or even risky behavior when it comes to cannabis use, one sign of dependency or of problematic use could be seeing an individual losing interest in the other things that they once enjoyed. Now, the amygdala. What is the amygdala responsible for? Well, this is what we see as sort of being the emotional trigger, right? When we talk about emotional memory, when we talk about the fight or flight response, this is that section of the brain that rapidly assesses any incoming information from stimuli around us and activates to either approach it, something that we want to do, or get away from it. This structure is very, very critical for detection and learning fear. Now, naturally, we as humans certainly we hope and we aspire to have sort of a healthy fear in unsafe situations, not necessarily to certainly fear everything, but at the same time to understand that there are things in this world that we need to be aware of, concerned about, and cautious with. This is also a section of the brain responsible for right-sized emotional responses. And THC, what we've seen is that it can also be responsible for making us a sort of hypersensitive to the signals of threat, almost sort of overacting this section of the brain. So one of the things to consider here is when we talk about signs of cannabis impairment or high levels of THC, we talk about people that deal with perhaps increased levels of paranoia, or in some cases, even moments of anxiety. If the section of the brain that's responsible for eliciting this sort of a response is being stimulated by a substance such as THC, again, this is where you can see this actually being explained on a neurological level. Andreas?
All right, and if we move on to our next color on our diagram, blue one relates to learning and memory. So our thalamus, this is a really cool structure of our brain because it sort of like connects the superficial or the shallow layers of our brain. It receives input and it sends it out to wherever it needs to be processed in the brain. And when I talk about input, I'm talking, for example, like if you were to hover your hand over a hot element on a stove, that heat is going to send your brain a signal of like, hey, danger, you could get burned here. And it's going to send that, for example, let's say to my cerebellum so that I draw my hand back, right? Now, there's a lot of things that our thalamus helps process, like our memory, our emotional behaviors, our motor functioning, our cognitive functioning, and our visual stimuli. But what I think is really cool to talk about this is sometimes when people consume cannabis, they have this idea that the experiences that they're encountering under the effects of cannabis are heightened compared to experiences in reality. So for example, when someone eats something, they're like, oh my God, this was the best slice of pizza that I've ever eaten, right? Or like, oh my God, this song is like the best song that I've ever listened to. And so what happens is that our thalamus has this ability to triage information, and it sort of has like a recycling bin. And it's sort of like when we consume cannabis, a lot of those things that are already in our brain go to that recycling bin for a short time. So even though I may have had thousands of pizza slices in my life, when I have one under the influence of cannabis, that information is sort of going to escape my brain or the processing of my brain. And then I'm going to think like my brain is going to think that this is the first time encountering that experience. And that's why it's so fascinating or so mind-blowing for some people. But the thing is that over time, THC accumulating in the thalamus decreases our ability to regulate our mood, to perform cognitively in a variety of different aspects or things throughout our life, and to regulate our sleep cycles in a healthy way, right? So these are things that over time can play a role in lessening the effectiveness at which our brains operate. And when we think about the hippocampus, so the hippocampus is very related to how we store memories. Maybe not so much our long-term memories are affected in our hippocampus, but our short-term memories definitely are. So this has to do with the way that we learn, the way that we encode memory, and the way that we spatially navigate the world. And I really like to talk about this one at the end because it's really tied in with our memory. When I talk about spatial navigation, and we have almost 100 people in our webinar today. I don't know any of you, obviously, and I don't know where you live. But if I asked you all, could you give me directions from the doorstep of your house to the nearest Tim Hortons? Would you be able to? And without moving, you would be able to tell me how to get to Tim Hortons. That is making use of that spatial navigation, right? Now, when someone is impaired by cannabis, this becomes a slippery slope, for example, for people who decide to get behind the wheel and drive if they are under the effects of cannabis. They might be in their same town or the same city where they have been for 20, 30 years, but believe when we say that definitely the brain takes an extra couple moments to process, oh, am I going here? Am I turning right? Should I switch to the other lane or not? And a big part of being a safe driver is performing maneuvers carefully, but also knowing the road because it's going to help you plan ahead, right? So other ways in which cannabis can interfere with memory and functioning, it can interfere the way that we learn facts, sequences, and places. And obviously we need these things, at least at the very basic formative years of our life for performing well in academic environments. So it's also something that we like to call out to young people when we do this presentation. And I think we have one left for you, Steve.
We do. We have the prefrontal cortex. Now, I actually, as someone that's worked with Andreas for a period of time, I really love the way that you actually explain this one. How would you explain the prefrontal cortex, Andreas?
Okay, so we said earlier on that the brain develops back to front, right? And roughly the human brain ends its developing around the age of 25. And that's really what differentiates a young person and a mature person's brain. And it's this part, the prefrontal cortex, which is at the forefront of our skull. And basically it's in charge of our executive functioning. So executive functioning involves a lot of different things that we need to do at a very high pace, in a very synchronized way throughout our days and throughout our lives. For example, making use of our working memory. It could be, for example, the first time that I go somewhere, I need to put it in my GPS, but the second time that I'm going to go to the same address, maybe I remember how to get there, and maybe I don't need my GPS for that. So that is one example of working memory under the faculties of executive functioning. Inhibitory control, something that young people or kids don't have so much because, again, they haven't developed this, but it's that ability to like bite your tongue before you say something snarky when someone gives you a gift that you don't like, for example, or being able to pull yourself back and your attention into this presentation in case you've been like daydreaming about what you would rather be doing instead of listening. And making use of your mental flexibility is knowing how you can adapt the way you perform in life through different situations, right? So the way that Steve and I are talking right now is the way that we talk when we deliver a presentation to an audience, but definitely it's probably not the way that we talk if we were having a conversation on the phone. And so that is being able to make use of that mental flexibility and adjust to different scenarios and situations, right? Now, people who consume cannabis early on in life, not only are they delaying this development of their prefrontal cortex, they're also hindering the amount or the potential at which it can develop, right? And so what this is going to look like for an adult person's life is they're going to struggle with organizational skills, making sound judgments, and planning. And so, for example, when we talk about sound judgment, as a young person, you might be a big risk taker. And then as you grow older, you realize that there are some risks that are not worth taking. Maybe someone who doesn't have that development continues to be reckless and a high risk taker throughout their whole life, for example. And for example, when it comes to planning, it's really funny because sometimes when someone is under the influence of cannabis and you're like, hey, do you want pizza or hamburger? And it just takes a long time for something to happen. So this is sort of what's happening in terms of like the speed or the pace at which our brain processes things, and it definitely slows down with inputs of THC in it. Absolutely.
Absolutely. I'm always fascinated looking at the prefrontal cortex. This is something when I worked in a previous program, always fascinated me to look at. So thank you. Now, what are the actual health risks of cannabis use to the developing brain? For those of you that have seen previous workshops that we've done, we discuss health risks of cannabis. We discuss mental health risks, physical health risks, impaired driving risks. Because this presentation today is specific to adolescent brain development, the focuses of the risks of cannabis use are specifically on the developing brain. And we know that cannabis can have potentially adverse effects on various aspects of mental and emotional development, depending on the age and the start of use and the durability or the duration and the intensity of use. So we certainly are going to explore some of these risks in the next few slides. Now, I think my presentation might have just froze there for a second.
There's a glitch in that slide, apologies.
But that's okay. It's okay, it happens. There we go. All right. So I have a question here for the audience. I mentioned I like a little bit of interactivity and polling, so you can put your response here in the chat. If I were to say to you that there are ways to consume cannabis that are completely harm-free, would you say this is absolutely true, or would you say this is false? What do you think? See our audience leaning one direction on this one, Andreas. Many people saying false here, right? Now,
truths.
A couple truths. Okay. Most people saying false, a few people saying true. Okay. Well, based on the research that we've seen, the response that we would say in the situation is that it's false, and here's why. People may choose to use a substance or engage in a behavior despite being aware of risks or of potential consequences. And if they do, often we explain harm reduction strategies, the importance of considering risk, deciding when it's a good idea to use, designating a driver, looking for lower potency products, and avoiding the illicit market. These are designed to lower the chances of negative effects or harms taking place. However, these strategies aren't exactly guarantees that absolutely no harm will emerge. So for example, if a person chooses to use cannabis only on weekends or when they have time off, they may not run into the complications of working or while trying to complete a school-related task while impaired, which avoids the risk of consequences in these areas. That's why we teach these sort of messages. It's important to understand that. We understand they have choice. However, if they decide to drive while impaired, even on a rare occasion, there is still the risk that they could be arrested, injured, or killed in a collision. Even looking at lower potency products, an individual with a history of, say, complications to mental health that they may either be unaware of or maybe using despite that awareness, there is still a risk there could be an issue there. Individuals with certain physical health complications, it may not be advisable for them to consume cannabis. So it's really important to be aware of many different factors when making decisions about cannabis use, focusing on many aspects of health. Now, if we actually look at the health risks of cannabis use when it comes to the brain, there's really four that we're going to focus on here. The first is the idea of attention and memory. Second is anxiety and depression. Third is cannabis use disorder. And finally is psychological disorders or schizophrenia. So if we were to start with looking at attention and memory, well, a person that begins using cannabis early on in life may be at an increased risk of some of the potential harms associated with cannabis use to the brain, especially as the brain is developing. In many presentations, in many discussions about substance use and about cannabis, you'll often hear presenters, speakers, researchers say, if you're thinking of using cannabis, consider avoiding or limiting use until age 25. Whenever I do presentations to youth, anytime that point comes up, they always ask, why is it wait till 25? And this is what we talk about in this presentation. It's what we've been getting at the whole time. The brain is undergoing most of its development until that point. So we need to make sure we're aware that the risks for a developing brain can be different than the risks for a fully developed brain. Now, cannabis intoxication has been linked to deficits in attentional focus, information processing, motor coordination, and reaction time, particularly with adolescence as the brain is still developing. Now, with that in mind, long-term and regular use of cannabis since adolescence is also associated with impairments in attention, memory, as well as verbal learning. So these skills that we talk about, these abilities, are associated with things like the ability to drive, the ability to work, the ability to learn new information, right? So if we understand that these sort of functions may be affected, then the things that we need to understand when it comes to keeping safe are planning a safe ride, considering responsibility at work, and delaying use until age 25. As we know, cannabis use can impair a person's ability to drive a car or operate other machinery. So it's best not to engage in these activities. But if someone is choosing to use cannabis, we like to focus on a positive message, which is to designate that safe driver and have a fallback plan. And again, the importance of delay use at 25 comes up due to the fact that cannabis use at a young age is associated with greater risks in these areas. Andreas?
Moving on to the next section.
It just froze up there for a second. There you go.
Okay, there we go. So the next one that we want to talk about is anxiety and depression. So when we encounter people who use cannabis, specifically young people, a lot of them report that the reason why they use cannabis is because it helps them manage or treat their anxiety. And some of them also have conversations around depression. So it was important for us to ask ourselves the question, can cannabis treat anxiety? And this is one of those slides where I have to say that the research is a bit wobbly on the not a definite answer, because what we've found is that while some people might use cannabis to help decrease their anxiety, it can be the case where overconsumption of cannabis can lead in some cases to higher anxiety levels. So it ends up being counterproductive. The other thing about that is that maybe someone uses cannabis to treat the anxiety itself, but not the root cause of that anxiety. So it wouldn't ultimately help to manage or to get rid of anxiety in a person, because you wouldn't be tackling the root cause. And now when we think about depression, this is also another interesting one, because for some people, maybe we found that cannabis users are at higher risk of depression compared to people who are non-users, especially if these are young users or frequent users. But it can also be the case where someone who might have a concurrence of other substance consumption besides cannabis, maybe for them, cannabis could end up being a harm reduction alternative from staying away from heavier drugs, or it could help them manage the mood swings that can come with depression, right? So it's not a clear way. We always like to recommend people that, hey, if you think that cannabis is helping you for these things, make sure that you have the endorsement or the backup of a clinician, a physician, or a practitioner that can help you manage your goals with your health and what you're doing to get to where you want to go, right? Because it's very easy to fall in that slippery slope of, well, cannabis is natural, therefore it can't harm me, or cannabis has worked for so many people that I know, so therefore it's going to work for me, right? And it's important to understand that it works different person by person and case by case. That's why there's not definite answers on this section.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So how is it you actually keep safe in this regard, Andreas?
All right, you want to click on the box and then we'll chat about
Absolutely.
it. Thank you. So I always like to recommend people to develop alternative coping mechanisms. Yes, fair enough. Cannabis may have that ability to help you relax, kick back, unwind a little bit, but make sure that you are aware that there's exercise, there's talking with someone, there's accessing counseling, there's even crying, which I think is a very healthy way to regulate emotions. So make sure that you, if you're someone who uses cannabis to cope with these things, make sure that you have 4 or 5 other strategies in your back pocket. And then we also like to say, use less frequently or in lower amounts if cannabis is already part of your living experience. So we're not a program that tries to promote anyone using cannabis, but we also want to meet people where they're at. So using less frequently could mean a lot of things. So if I'm someone that uses cannabis every day, maybe just leaving it before bedtime so it doesn't interfere with my daily activities. If I use several times a week, maybe just leaving it for the weekend so it doesn't impact my commitments and my responsibilities. Or lower amounts could be, maybe I don't need to smoke a full joint to feel the effect that I'm after. Maybe I just need to have a small puff from a pipe, or, you know, like reduce either the amount or the percentage of THC in the products. And then let's explore cannabis use disorder, which is another, it's just a clinical term for addressing dependence or addiction towards cannabis. So I have something to say before we dive into this information. Just because someone tries cannabis doesn't automatically mean that they're going to become dependent or that their life is finished or it's ruined, which is sort of like the ideas that I grew up with when I was younger. Because in fact, not everyone who uses cannabis will become dependent to cannabis. Overall, it's only 9% of the population who become dependent towards cannabis in the overall population. I will say, however, that for the younger population, for people who start their cannabis use in their teenage years, the risk of becoming dependent goes up to 17%, whereas for the overall population, it's 9%. So what happens, and maybe here, Steve, you can help me clicking through the slide. So we like to place the experience of using cannabis on this spectrum, where, for example, maybe I'm someone who has never used cannabis, I have no interest in it. So I would be at this part of the spectrum, not feeling any of the negative effects. But maybe I am someone who uses cannabis once in a blue moon, right? And maybe I'm very good at saying, I'm never going to mix it with alcohol. I'm never going to do it before a school day. And I'm never going to do it alone, because maybe for me doing it alone is a red flag of dependence. And maybe I'm very good at sticking to those rules, right? So I would be a cannabis user, but I would be a low risk user. Maybe over time, I started consuming a lot more cannabis, right? And so maybe I started slacking at school or at work, or I stopped going to my sport practice, or I was uninterested in things that were part of my life before. I would start to see a bit more of the riskier, problematic part of that spectrum of use here. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we've been going on a linear direction and that is going to eventually lead to dependent use, where cannabis use feels less like a choice and more like a coping strategy, or where people might break the laws or get into trouble to access cannabis. It doesn't necessarily work that way. The idea of the spectrum is really cool, and we like to give this information to young people because someone can fluctuate through different stages of the spectrum throughout their life, and someone can also stay for long periods of time at different parts of the spectrum, depending on what their health goals are and how much self-awareness they have of themselves and how much knowledge they have about cannabis as well. But having given you all this background, it's fair to say that cannabis use disorder has been diagnosed, and it has about 12 different symptoms that someone can identify. Just because you see 1 or 2 in a person doesn't automatically mean that they might have it, but the disorder is actually classified in acute, mild, and moderate. And so depending on how many signs you see here, you can start to sort of like gauge an idea of where a person is at. So if someone is unable to stop or cut down use despite wanting to do so, or if someone is unable to focus on responsibilities, or if it's causing conflict with family and friends about use. So those are red flags of problematic cannabis use that could lead to dependence. Other 3 that we have, Steve, I wonder if you can click. People who use daily or very habitually, it's also a red flag. People who start their cannabis use very early on in life, and people who use it to cope with depression, anxiety, stress, and problems. We touched on that earlier. Also people who use it as their major or sometimes only form of recreation. People who use it while driving or while performing activities that they know they shouldn't and they still do it. And maybe someone who's aware of the risks and they still decide to consume cannabis. And also, as we said earlier, stealing to pay for cannabis or needing more cannabis over time to feel the same effects. So that idea of growing tolerance towards THC, and spending less and less time over time with friends and loved ones to prioritize cannabis use. So again, just because 1 or 2 might be part of a person's experience, might be an invitation to see where are you at with your cannabis consumption, but it doesn't automatically mean that they might have a cannabis use disorder. It's important to look at it though.
Absolutely. And I do see two questions here in the chat panel. The first one about adolescent use. What we've seen in the research is, and this is something that's been reported through, we've seen it on Health Canada, we've seen it with the CPS, we saw it with the NIDA in the United States. We've seen it in research going back a number of years, that 9% of people that begin using cannabis during adulthood will report issues associated with a cannabis use disorder. That's where we see that 9% rate. Individuals that report beginning use during adolescence, this rate actually increases up to about 16%. So the risk factors associated with CUD, we actually see are greater when an individual begins use earlier on in life. And that's one thing that we like to really call out there. And the second question here, yeah, I was just about to comment. Someone asked if we had slides on information of CBD in children usage for medical purposes. One thing I will mention about the nature of our program is we do focus primarily on recreational cannabis use. And what we do like to call out is if we do get asked questions, especially by youth, about potential medical uses of cannabis, we do like to point out that if they do have any questions or concerns or are curious to learn more about the medical applications or potential of cannabis, is that this is something we do recommend they consult with their healthcare provider, their family doctor, their healer, is to really learn more about those potential medical uses. Is that fair to say, Andreas?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm also just reading a couple more questions that came in. I want to address this one. Could you suggest ways to strengthen the brain after years of heavy use during adolescence? For example, if someone smoked heavily and daily from age 13 to 20. Also, something interesting that we found on the research is that some research has concluded that if someone ceased their cannabis use, their brain can definitely go back to optimal functioning levels. Some other research is contradictory because they say the opposite, is that if that onset of cannabis use starts early on in life, it's very little possibility for the brain to recover to its full capacity. But there's been instances of people self-reporting that over time they haven't experienced or the drawbacks of cannabis have lasted during the impairment, but not so much after the fact.
I do want to add, I see a couple of other questions coming in here as well. The first one is the risk of use daily when it comes to a sleeping disorder. What I've seen here in research and reports can be a little bit conflicting. And again, it's really talking about how cannabis can affect different people differently. Some people may actually struggle with sleep disorders and find that the use of cannabis may actually help them sleep better. So you'll hear people that will say, well, I was able to use cannabis as like a sleep aid. But we might not see it necessarily clinically prescribed, because for some people, while it may actually help with sleep, you might actually find others, they may find themselves more likely to have a lack of energy or feel tired or even nap more during the day and struggle to sleep more at night. So there's really a lack of consistency to say that it would help all or would not help all. So more research is really required there. One of the other things that I did see had to do with the resources to show youth regarding cannabis use. And I'm going to do a little bit of a shameless program self-promotion here, but two things that usually I recommend when it comes for youth engagement is, number one, our program does actually offer workshops differentiated in the subjects that you've seen here for youth. So we do actually offer these presentations for free all across Canada to youth ages 12 and up. We also do have various resources on our Youth Knowledge Hub, which is currently undergoing a change in its aesthetic layout this week, which is great, including fact sheets that youth can peruse through if they want to learn a little bit more about different topics related to cannabis use, as well as some of the recordings of the videos, for example, like the recording we're doing here today. And we do also offer links and connections to resources from external providers. And we have some on there, including the Rural Cannabis Exhibit from Northern Alberta, which is an excellent resource. Schizophrenia and the Schizophrenia Society of Canada's Cannabis and Psychosis program, we do link to their resources as well. And we do also recommend for educators and providers and caregivers to look at resources, particularly from the CSSDP, which is the Canadian Students for Sensible Drug Policy, as well as the resources created by our friends at Drug Free Kids Canada, who have a wonderful resource for adults looking to have these conversations with youth. So, sorry, we were getting a lot of questions all popping in there at the same time. Andreas, I think you touched on a lot of these CUD related pieces. Is that correct?
Yeah. No, and it's really good to see that people are asking very pertinent and interesting questions. And also, like, one question that just actually challenged me and it's helping me like look farther and look deeper into a couple of things that have come up during the presentation. So, and it's also great to see that people almost an hour in are still paying attention and engaged. So let's take us home. So strategies for keeping safe when we're thinking about cannabis use disorders. So the cannabis industry has this wonderful slogan. It's more specific to edibles, but I think it can be extrapolated to everything. Start low, go slow. Just because you try something and you don't right away feel the effect that you're after doesn't mean that you have to like do more. In fact, the opposite will be best. Wait a little bit and then go slow. You don't need to consume a very strong THC product. If you're having an edible, you don't need to eat the whole product. You can just like eat a small piece of it and gauge the effect that it has on your body little by little, right? The alternative, eating it all, is going to be counterproductive to your intention. Avoid mixing with other substances. So certainly an idea that we sometimes touch on is this idea of crossfading when someone is intoxicated by alcohol and then they consume cannabis. Really exacerbates the feelings of feeling intoxicated by alcohol. And it can lead to very unpleasant sensations of nausea and vomiting. And know that you can access support services. So one of the things that I really like about our job is that we have these conversations about cannabis on a daily basis. Every time we do it, we're lowering the stigma a little bit. We're allowing people to talk about it more openly. When I do these workshops a lot of the kids ask me, do you or have you ever used cannabis? And I always giggle because I think if this was about alcohol, that would be way more normalized than it is right now, right? But knowing or normalizing the conversation is a great way for people to know that they can access support services should they need to. And then our last one, Steve.
Absolutely. Let's take a look at discussion around psychotic disorders and schizophrenia. The exact underlying mechanism is still really largely unknown. We know that there is evidence that using cannabis use may increase the risk of an individual developing psychosis and or schizophrenia, particularly individuals that may have certain vulnerabilities to these conditions. Now, the Canadian Public Health Organization reported in 2018, quote, beginning cannabis use at an early age, using daily or almost daily, and using high THC potency products. These would be those strong products such as extracts that we see that have 60, 70, 80% even THC content, or even certain vape products and juices that can have potencies as high as 80 or 90%. The use of these sort of very high levels of this psychoactive substance may increase the risk of developing these conditions. Now, it's not to say that it's an exact straight line. If we know the rate of cannabis use is, we'll say I believe it's 1 in 5 over a certain age would report having used cannabis. Doesn't mean they use all the time, but they've reported using cannabis in the past 12 months. Over, I believe it's the age of, I want to say it's 18, but I'd have to look at the exact numbers. We report it more in the landscape presentation. If there was an exact perfect line there, then that would suggest that these numbers would be substantially higher, but we know they're not. However, we do know that there is a connectivity there between individuals that have a vulnerability or a family or a medical history of these sorts of psychological conditions, that the use of cannabis may actually increase their risk of developing issues or complications due to these parts. Don, I see your question here about the recording itself. We will actually be posting it on our website in the coming days. I just have to get it processed, which you can find at ymcagta.org/YCAP. So I explained it at the beginning, but I do like to bring it up at the end. So I'm glad that you mentioned that as well, Don, because I'm going to call that out at the very end of the presentation as well. But when it comes to psychological disorders and schizophrenia, the things that we like to point out here are understanding sort of your risk profile. So do you have a medical history or a family history of psychological disorders? Social anxieties, major depressive, bipolar, psychosis, schizophrenia, the use of a substance that can have psychoactive effects or impact the ability of the brain to process and take on new information, especially if there is a potential vulnerability there. It may not be recommended that someone with that sort of a history use cannabis products, particularly higher potency products, which brings us to that second point, the importance of looking for lower potency products. If someone is thinking of smoking cannabis or inhaling cannabis from a psychological level, they may be better suited to look for THC potency products that are under 10%, under 15%. And again, sort of starting with that low amount and taking their time, not necessarily consuming all of it in one go, but being able to take breaks. And finally, it is important to avoid synthetic cannabis products. We are a harm reduction program. We're not an abstinence-based program, but we understand that synthetic cannabinoids are not only illegal, but they can be very physically damaging to the body. These products can cause certain organ failure, reduce blood flow, and in serious situations can cause seizure or even fatality. This is synthetic cannabis products. These are not real cannabinoids from real cannabis plants. So we generally recommend that individuals avoid synthetic cannabis products. So very last thing before we wrap up, I know we're a couple minutes over, but we do like to point out, if you are in need of local support services, where is it that you can go? Another poll question we want to ask you. If someone uses support services, will their parents be notified? True or false? We've got a lot of service providers here on the line today. What do we think? Tons and tons and tons of falses. Absolutely. We understand that youth services have the responsibility of ensuring a person's privacy and confidentiality unless they are communicating an intention of potential harm to either themselves or to others. So again, we do like to point out that if someone does have any questions, one of the things that we like to point out, and I've got a national provider here, and as I'm presenting with Andreas, our BC provider, I've actually got a BC one here as well. The first national one that we always like to point out for people all across Canada, especially for youth, is Kids Help Phone. Kids Help Phone is available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They do offer services by phone, text, or online. They have various sort of skill building games and activities. Kids can connect at any point. Individuals who are a little bit older, perhaps post-secondary age, there is an equivalent available in Ontario and Nova Scotia, known as Good to Talk. And with Andreas, as I know you're presenting out in BC, what do we know about provincial providers like Foundry BC, Andreas?
I am a big fan of the Foundry, which is a provincial specific to BC service for 12 to 24-year-olds. They were very, very good at the beginning of the pandemic at revamping their online engagement options. And so they've developed this app that is really, really cool. It's very similar to Kids Help Phone in the sense that they can connect you with a counselor, with learning resources, with group counseling, with like community support. So definitely, and actually, I don't know if anyone in the room is joining in from BC, but if they are, definitely check out the Foundry BC. They have a number of centers and they have a plan over the next 3 years to increase their reach to like 25 different cities throughout British Columbia, which is not a small feat.
Absolutely. So the very last thing I would like to do is take a moment to thank all of you for joining us today. Should you have any questions or concerns, you can reach out to us directly at our intake, which is YCAP at ymcagta.org, or you can visit our website, ymcagta.org/YCAP. You will also see on the left-hand side, there is a QR code that if you scan it with your phone, you can take our post-presentation survey. Just take a few minutes, some simple strongly agree to strongly disagree questions, and some opportunities for comments and additional feedback. I do see more comments coming in from the chat panel. A lot of thanks. Emailing resources, certainly. What you can do is if you send along an email to me at YCAP at ymcagta.org. What you can do is if you send me an email, I will be able to provide you with the resources that we spoke about earlier, as we do have a lovely resource sheet. And again, if you want to learn more from some of our fact sheets, you can certainly visit our website as well. And this video will be posted on there within the next week or two, as we wanted to make sure that we had a good recording set up to go against the rest of the hub. So thank you all very much. Is there anything you want to add while we're here today, Andreas?
No, it was a great pleasure to facilitate this session with you, Steve. Thanks everyone for your lovely comments. I was the person who developed and created this presentation, so it's very humbling to see that people were engaged and keen to stay until the very end. So that really warms my heart. So thank you very much.
Absolutely. And that's definitely why I was really glad you were able to do the presentation with me today, Andreas. You did a wonderful job as always.
Thanks, Steve.
Thank you, everybody.